I'm Steve Ehrmann, retired independent scholar, author, recently became a grandfather, which is important to me.
Hey, congratulations.
And I've been working around trying to make higher education better for over 50 years now.
Welcome, welcome. We're glad you're here. And Kristen?
Hi, I'm Kristen Kusko. I am the robotics lab director at Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology and a future candidate for the program. And I'm actually just very interested in the digital divide and how is it that we can help bring equity to education.
Very good, very good. Welcome. I'm Bryan Alexander. I'm a futurist who specializes in higher education. I teach in the LDT program, and I'll be the main question flinger for the next hour. So to begin with, these questions start at a pretty high level, then they reach an even higher level still, and then they zoom in and drill down to some narrower topics. So thinking about higher education as a whole, Steve, what are some of the changes and transformations that you've observed over the past 5 or 6 months as higher education has had to confront COVID-19, as well as this kind of national anti-racist mobilization?
I started off by saying that I'm retired, and so I haven't been in an institution for over 40 years now. So I know what I'm reading in the Chronicle and inside higher ed and conversations I've had with people. What interests me is what's been going on for the last 50 years and how does what's going on today interact with that. And what's been going on for 50 years, I think, is a very, very, very slow and uneven shift from what's been called the instruction paradigm, which is you judge higher education by its resources and the qualifications of incoming students. We've got a lot of resources, highly qualified faculty, great incoming students. That's a high quality institution. Toward a learning paradigm where at least part of the quality judgment is, so what resulted for the students while they were in college and after they graduated? What were you able to do for them? It's a shift, therefore, between a content delivery model, teaching is providing the content, to more of a capability development effort where a lot of what's important is the nature of the practice that the learner is doing and the kind of coaching that they're doing and so on. We've seen changes over that period of time on the equity of access front. And I think like a lot of people, my views of particular access issues for African Americans have changed significantly over the last 7 months. And it's obviously, it's embarrassing to say that, but I'm further along than I was. I've worked on issues of trying to open up higher education for African Americans and other underserved groups. But I think that the difference between African Americans and a number of other underserved groups had not been as forceful for me as it now has become. And then the third thing that is part of that larger change and some other things that have been going on is just how affordable higher education is. And it has implications for access, for example. Back in the instruction paradigm thing where everything is resources, the more you charge for tuition, the better institution you were. I actually was vice provost at an institution which had taken the policy of increasing its reputation for quality by significantly increasing tuition. And for a while it worked. So we're going from that to saying, all right, if we have to really think about the time of these students, how big a slice of their lives are we talking about? Are we talking, and the time of the faculty and the money that's available to be paid in and has to be paid out. That's a really different conversation than if you once you stop thinking about more money, more quality, less money, less quality, that kind of thinking, it just has to go away. And there's no reason why it shouldn't. There's no evidence that there's any linkage between raw wealth for an institution on the one hand and the quality of what its students have learned on the other.
Those are three huge developments. And I love how you connect these long-term trends, especially the 50-year shift from the instruction paradigm to the learning one, to what's happening right now in 2020, which may be partly an accelerant. Well, let me kind of flank that question. That's a question about qualitative impressions and assessments towards a more quantitative way. When you look at higher education as it changes, again, either this year as you look at it from retirement through journalism and so forth, or overall, what metrics do you prefer to track, or what trends do you prefer to track? Well,
one that's comparatively easy to gather and has some value are statistics that are associated with graduation rates, speed to graduation, retention rates, and so on. Taken by themselves, they can easily be distorted. That's why I always think you have to think in terms of quality and access and affordability together. Because as soon as you start saying, well, the one that really matters is this one, and I'm just going to focus on that, you can distort the system really easily. And you can end up wasting a lot of time and a lot of money by different things beginning to go at cross purposes with each other. But if you're trying to improve quality and affordability and access, then graduation rates can be an index of quality. You know, you've been trying to improve the quality of instruction, graduation rates are going up. At least there's a correlation that the one might have something to do with the other. And if you find that the different underserved groups are converging toward the same graduation rates as the historically privileged groups, that says something about the equity of access, that it's not just equity for getting into college, it's equity in graduating with an excellent education.
The full life cycle, if you will.
Yeah. The thing on the other side that I would love to see more of, and yet where we're really, really primitive still, is what is it that students have learned to do by the time they graduate? I'm talking about modes of thinking, for example, the ability to make use of content they've learned either formally or informally in the face of tough tasks. We've been talking about the need to shift to outcomes as a frame of reference, and specifically for accreditation to shift towards outcomes as a means of reference for at least 30 years, maybe 40. There's a date that's a little fuzzy in my mind. It's been a long time. And you would expect by now that we would say have at least some benchmarks in what are the writing skills of our graduates?
Yeah.
You know, and controlling for different things. Can we explain why students in this institution seem to be writing about 10% better than they did a decade ago, whereas students in this other institution aren't writing as well as their predecessors did a year ago? We're very, very light on any kind of evidence about changes in what it is that people have learned and what value it is for them to learn. And as long as that goes on, the discussion about improving quality, access, and affordability is going to be impoverished in that way, because we really do need to understand better than we do what the effect of all this is on student action. The place where we've been tackling it is sort of from the bottom up, and that's a good way to start, which is to say, let's look at projects of individual students and use rubrics and judge them so that at least the student and the faculty and the institution can be reflecting on how has the student been developing over the course of the time that they're at the institution. And there's some nice things going on there. One that interests me particularly is at the University of Central Oklahoma. which has a system called Stellar, Student Transformative Learning Record.
Yeah.
And to just put it in a nutshell, it's like an e-portfolio
Right.
where the artifacts are coming from all phases of the student's life, not just from their courses, and yet are being judged against the same rubrics. Critical thinking, undergraduate research. These experiences and these capabilities can be developed in a variety of ways across the student's life in and around the institution. And they're being, with Stellar, they're being synthesized into an academic record of the student's development.
And a Title III grant really helped make that work, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's really important.
And really accelerated. They've been working along these lines for 10 or 15 years, but when they got the Title III grant about 4 or 5 years ago, they really were able to step it up.
Well, thank you. That's a really, really rich answer to how we can use metrics well, how we can distort them, and the work we have to do. Let's take this a little further. Let's expand our gaze and look a little longer term. And again, your long track record of so much work with this really, I think, gives you a great perspective. Looking forward, what do you think some of the longer term changes will be to higher education as a result of this extraordinary year of crises?
Well, I will give some hopeful guesses. I don't think I've got much more behind them than that. But the long-term trend that I'm seeing is towards slowly growing emphasis on students working on complex real-world kinds of projects and projects that matter to them beyond the issue of what grade they might get. Perhaps it's a project that's being able to be used by people outside the university, service learning kinds of things and internships. We have been presented with several overwhelmingly important issues for students to work on. And where there are reasons to think that many students would say, I've got to take this seriously because this really matters.
Yeah.
Having to do with climate change, having to do with Black Lives Matter, having to do with global pandemics. You know, we can't let these crises go to waste, the old saying goes. It provides a lot of opportunities for institutions that have begun to shift towards preparing students and giving students exercise in using their own minds to apply what they've learned to something that's important. There are a lot more examples of projects for students to work on in teams and together within their own institution and across institutional lines, even internationally, to have students working in a team who are from different continents but are working on an issue of common concern.
That really changes things, and that is very hopeful, I find. Well, let's add a couple of other major trends to this and think, you know, we're talking about a global pandemic. We're talking about the vast topic of institutional racism, but let's add other problems of similar scale. I mean, how do you think we'll take colleges and universities forward into the other major crises? I'm thinking about, for example, economic inequality, or thinking about climate change.
One of the things that I hope is happening, we don't have good measures of this yet, but going back to that instruction paradigm, which is, one shorthand for that is the way college was when I went to college. One of the features, especially in more research-intensive institutions, is extensive autonomy for faculty. They had their small ponds, which was a course, another course over here, and a lot of autonomy about what to do there. And some of that logic also extends to other parts of the university, I think particularly of teaching centers, which were small, marginal, easy to dispense with, because teaching was seen as being a very easy thing to do. You know, the hard thing was to get the content for the faculty. The easy thing was to deliver it. And these teaching centers generally set their own agendas, trying to figure out what was going to work with faculty. Now, take us to a world where we're going to work on, where university is going to work on all the problems, Bryan, that you were just describing. Every single one of them requires some degree of coordination. The increase in collective power to some degree at the expense of individual autonomy to do whatever you want, whenever you want. And our culture is based on an awful lot of people who were attracted to come to colleges because they really valued that individual autonomy, and who tend to see any kind of, I'm going to exaggerate a little bit here now, but there's some people, some faculty and staff who would see any attempt to work collaboratively on jointly agreed to goals as being ipso facto an invasion of their academic freedom. I don't think if you look into the roots of academic freedom, it actually is, but there are a lot of people who will say that, and they'll feel offended, angry, betrayed. And it's the need for a cultural change of that sort, as much as anything else, that's going to be a limiting factor on universities' abilities to work on the issues you just described on a scope that's larger than a single faculty member or maybe a single center's research program, or delegating it to a single course. Everybody will have to take a Black Lives Matter course, which means that all the rest of the faculty don't need to worry about those issues because it's been taken care of in that course. We know how ridiculous that is. We know how terribly that actually works. But it's that kind of thinking is the kind of thinking that came out of a time when faculty were much more autonomous, well, somewhat more autonomous than they are now. And I think that balance needs to continue to shift, not totally away from autonomy. That would be as bad as having only autonomy. But there has to be, something closer to a 50-50 thing. And to go back to the example of teaching centers, for example, the kind of teaching centers that need to be developing are progressively larger, progressively better staffed, more budgeted, but less autonomous as individual units. They are a strategic part of the institution's attempts to deal with, name the issue, global warming, Black Lives Matter, crime, poverty. They're an integral part, a specialized part of a larger effort to get very big things done. And I think certainly when I compare colleges, when I was a student, to colleges and universities now, there's much more talk now of the institution tackling difficult issues than there was then. Then, to the extent that it was being talked about, it was mainly being talked about in terms of individual faculty or small research groups. To get to where we need to go, to be able to make these kinds of really meaningful gains in a global context where those gains are desperately needed, we have to be rethinking how within universities we relate to each other and how we work together.
That is I think that the breadth of that vision is well suited to the size of these challenges and these big trends. And I love the way you integrated teaching centers into this problem. Yeah, we can talk about that. There's a lot to go with that.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask a question that kind of circles back to what we were seeing before, but also I think really connects with what you're seeing in terms of accelerated change. And you're a close observer of higher education. I mean, you know the sector very, very well and deeply. Most people don't, including a lot of people in higher education. So one of the things that I think has happened this year is that the shocks to the system have revealed a lot about higher education that wasn't normally talked about. shook us awake and showed us things that we hadn't really been conscious of, or that we just weren't up at the forefront. Now, I'm curious. I mean, again, given your terrific perspective, what do you think that crises of this year have revealed about American higher education?
I won't say this is the most important thing, but it's the one that comes to my mind first. All along for the last 30 years or more, faculty and institutions should have been making better use of technology to improve the quality of learning. And I'm not talking about content delivery, hardly at all. I'm talking more about the ability for students to address more complicated and increasingly ill-mannered, wicked problems because they have more powerful tools, because they have better communications channels, access to more information that they can use. I've always particularly been a fan of the potential importance of asynchronous text exchange, email, threaded discussions online. 40 years ago, maybe, I was talking to a faculty member in philosophy at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And he said, one of the frustrating things for me is you can't talk philosophy with an undergraduate.
What?
It just can't be done.
What?
But email, he said, if you slow down the pace of the exchange so they don't have to respond instantly to what you said, instantly decide to figure out what they say, it can be a very productive and very enjoyable conversation about philosophy. So I think he was exaggerating to make it a point, but I've seen a lot more evidence in different spots that there's this potential for a more thoughtful pace of conversation if the system and the faculty member and the other students all combine to help students realize the importance of it and gradually learn how to do it. That fills a gap in what was, when I was a student, between the instant back and forth of office hours or asking questions in class or being asked a question in class on the one hand, and homework or tests where the loop took days to unfold and generally had very little to it by the time it got to an end. B minus maybe, awkward. These aren't really helpful for people getting to learn, but the slower pace of asynchronous, I think, can be useful in helping students learn higher order reasoning and critical thinking. So we have this potential that's been in our learning management systems for a long time.
Right.
And it's one of the keys to an institution being able to respond to something like COVID-19 by pivoting fairly smoothly into a fully online operation. Let's imagine all the courses had been blended at this point. They all had healthy online discussion components. For most institutions, that wasn't true. For some, it was, and the ones for whom it was, I'm thinking particularly of University of Central Florida, one of the institutions that I've been studying.
Yeah.
Their history of thinking about how to take instructional advantage of technology, not just for access, but to offer really high quality programs, goes back to about 1997. And as online learning began to grow, just within the first year or two after that, the senior administration, especially the deans, agreed that faculty had to have extensive training and consulting help before they were allowed to develop and teach a course online. Now, most of their online courses are taught by full-time faculty. In fact, a higher percentage of UCF's online courses are taught by full-time faculty than the campus courses are. And over the course of 30 years, something like, nobody knows for sure, but a vague guess would be about 2/3 of the faculty at the University of Central Florida, one of the largest institutions in the country, had experience teaching online and teaching blended courses.
Wow.
And an even larger fraction of their students had the experience of taking at least one online course. And when you're in that kind of situation where it's been emblematic of the quality of the institution, how these online courses are put together, as well as important, crucial parts of their access agenda and crucial parts of their affordability agenda, that meant that when UCF was hit by the pandemic, they were able to pivot much more gracefully. I won't say entirely gracefully, it's difficult everywhere, but they had a huge head start and a running head start on most other institutions in the country.
That's at enormous scale. I mean, they have a huge student body.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like 65,000 students or
That's
something.
about what I recall too. Yeah.
I may circle back to this question because this is a rich one. But thank you. I really appreciate you zeroing in on asynchronous technology. Let's narrow our focus a little bit. I want to zero in on a couple of things myself. One of them is a professional question. In some ways, to my mind, 2020 has been the year of the instructional designer. In March, IDs did just tremendous, heroic work. And also, I mean, along with them, academic technologists, educational technologists, librarians who work on this. So I'm curious, looking at that profession, and that's a profession that our graduate students often enter. How can that profession contribute to the transformation of higher education now? What do they have to add? What can those instructional designers do?
Not all instructional designers are created equal. And there's one set of instructional designers, which may be a large fraction or a small fraction, I don't know, but I've met some of them, who have a particular routine that they bring to the task of instructional design, a set of steps, a set of things that they usually refer to. And as long as you're letting them or asking them to do that, they're fine. And they make that kind of contribution. But if you ask them to pull back and say, well, circumstances have changed, and we need to adapt what we're doing. And in that process, we need to think a little bit more about basic principles and how they can be translated into this somewhat different situation. And the instructional designers I'm thinking of just panic at that point because it isn't what they were hired to do. And they don't feel confident doing it, and they want to feel confident in what they do. As you know, there are plenty of other instructional designers who are great at what I just described. So that, for example, if you said, well, given the this pandemic-induced change, we need you to spend about half your time coaching faculty, not designing courses, but coaching faculty in larger and smaller groups and providing consulting help. And there are some who will eat that up and do well at it. And I think quite a few of the instructional designers at UCF did just that. But as I say, I've seen other instructional designers who, when I asked them to do something like that, looked at me like I was crazy and refused.
I can see that. Sorry, I can see that. I had to mute myself because of the weather and my cat's reactions to them. But this is, I think, a great way of considering how best to prepare instructional designers for the world. Speaking of which, Kristen, you had a question you wanted to ask. Why don't you weigh in?
Yes, definitely. And I just wanted, before I ask the question, our high school is one of the top high schools in the country, and we try very, very hard to make sure that our kids are addressing real world problems whenever they're doing their classes. So I agree with your point about the trends are trying to be more helpful for real problems. So yeah. And the next thing is, my question is, in a recent AAC and U blog post, you talked about the iron triangle. or the supposed inevitable relationship between cost, access, and quality in education. With colleges and universities facing serious financial constraints and inevitable budget cuts due to the health crisis, what are some ways that they can continue to improve equitable access and quality?
And do it affordably. Each one of these three goals, or whatever specifics within these three umbrellas, you know, which aspects of quality, which aspects of equity, which aspects of affordability. I think it really helps, and I think it's really hard to do, but it's very helpful when you can do it, to have a very specific goal and for there to be ways to hold yourself to that goal. On the affordability side, for example, the one that seems to have been, I've seen two examples. The one in a couple of institutions was, we are one of the lower priced public institutions in our state, and we intend to remain so. Even though the amount of money that we're getting from the state is going down and down and down, we are not going to raise tuition. Or if we are, we're not going to raise it much. We aren't going to raise it so much so that we're no longer the least expensive public institution. That's Governor's State, just outside Chicago. The other example was one of the two that I've studied where basically a new program or a new institution was being created from scratch in order to be the kind of place that can do, Kristen, what you just said, have high quality, equity, and affordability. And in that case, one of the very first decisions that they made at Southern New Hampshire University was, what was the tuition going to be? And that it had to be dramatically low. They wanted that to be one of the things that would attract people's attention to the program. And they took additional steps to make sure it was affordable. Instead of recruiting students en masse, you know, through advertising and this, that, and the other thing, they partnered with employers and then with community organizations that were providing educational services in their communities. And then to the employees or to the students and the community partners, they said, you know, we're offering 2-year and 4-year degrees. It's this price, and it's quite possible that the entity with which you're affiliated will pay some of that tuition assistance in one way or the other. So that's just a little bit. I mean, there are other things to say about College for America or about Governor's State about how that tied in with their efforts to have high quality and high degree of accessibility. But it helps to realize when you're making these decisions that if you take any particular activity, sophisticated activity, complex activity, and ask yourself, well, how much time does it take to do that? Or how much money does it take to do that? The answer is almost always, it depends. And what it depends on usually is, well, how much money have you been devoting to it so far? How much time have you been devoting to it so far? If you kind of get in the habit of doing it at a particular level, pretty quickly, that seems to be the way to do it. If we have less money, then we can't do it at all. But meanwhile, at another institution, I don't know, that's also teaching developmental math, that all along had less money than you do, they're really happy with what they're doing. It's costing less, and they're happy in part because they just got a little more money, whereas your folks are unhappy because they just got a little less. But they came to do the things, basically the same thing generically, but to do it in different ways, depending on what the history had been of how much money was available and how much time was available. The how much money available part is sometimes called the revenue theory of costs. How much do you spend per student at your college? Well, it has to do with how much money we've been able to raise in the past and how we've been spending it. That's about how much money we spend per student. In time, the phrase is Parkinson's law. work expands to fill the time available, right? So take two faculty members, they're each teaching a class of 30 people, and ask yourself, ask empirically, how much time is each faculty member spending per student? And the answer is, the one answer will probably have almost nothing to do with the other one. One faculty member might be spending 5 times more time per student than the other one is. And partly because that's just what they've been able to get in the habit of doing. Mm-hmm. And now they'll fight to try to be sure that they can maintain something like that level of service, which to the faculty member spending less time will seem like a waste and a huge threat to all the other things they're doing with their time, other than teaching those 30 students. They've each gotten kind of accustomed to a particular way of allocating their 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. But it's likely to be different. This is an area, by the way, where there's much more research is needed. What I was just saying about those two faculty, that's the result of one study of 9 faculty at one institution, where the driving question of the research was, does it take more time to teach an online student or to teach a campus student? And they worked with faculty to try to figure out all the different times, some obvious, some not so obvious, that went into preparing the course and teaching the course and so on. They did insist that the faculty they interviewed all had to be experienced teaching online and on campus, and often taught the same course in both formats. And what they found was, for each faculty member, very roughly speaking, it took about the same amount of time to teach an online student as a campus student. But if you looked across faculty, the difference in the amount of time that they were spending per student varied radically. So the amount of time being spent per student was not particularly a function of pedagogy. It was a function of the way that faculty member chose to spend time, or felt constrained to spend time, to say the same thing in a different way.
This makes for an interesting metric to think about as well.
Yeah.
By the way, how's the storm seems to have abated here? Are you still being zotzed there, Kristen and Steve?
No, it's raining, but not nearly as hard.
Yeah. For us, it's still dark as night outside. So hopefully it should be passing over soon.
All right, just want to keep an eye on things. Also want to keep an eye on time. We have about 11 minutes left on the clock, and I want to make sure that we get the most out of you, Steve. And this is terrific so far. Kristen, thank you for a great question. And Steve, I love where you went in answering it. Let me ask another question, which is really a kind of narrower question. One of the developments of 2020 that may have made you glad to be retired is that there's been a kind of upsurge in skepticism about science. A lot of hostility or suspicion aimed at public health science, for example. And one of the questions we were wondering about was, what does this skepticism tell us about the relevance of academic science? I mean, we in universities and colleges, we do research, we produce science, and we try to craft messages to persuade the public that this science matters. But what has this year told us about how well we do that crafting?
Well, obviously not well enough, but it is so lashed up with a particular kind of politics. And I think someone once said, the opposite of liberal education is not conservative education. The opposite of liberal education is authoritarian education, right? Because liberal the root of that is choice. You're learning to make informed choices for yourself. Yeah. And as I look at things, my impression that there are interest groups who don't see that as being in their best interests, to have an educated public, a public that's sophisticated about how it votes, how it makes a life, the amount of money it can earn. And it's not that simple, obviously. Throw in religion, throw in a number of other factors. But we colleges are not in this in a vacuum by any means. We're one of a number of combatants. I was trying to remember that line from Dover Beach about confused combat at night, but at any rate, it's
armies that clash by night.
Yes, ignorant armies that clash by night. That's what some people want, and they've had some good licks in. I think that the kind of education that too many people have had in higher education, focusing on the faculty member's expert and the student as the novice doing what he or she is told, reinforces the authoritarian kind of education. So we're not guiltless in this. I hope that the kinds of reforms generally that we've been talking about can begin to shift the balance a little bit within colleges and universities, and perhaps in interaction with the rest of society, we can all rise up a little bit. I think one of the, I hate to say positive things about a pandemic, but whatever your politics are, that people still die. It's amazing. People on politics says they won't, that it's going to go away. People with another kind of politics and one that involves more reliance on science says this is the way it's going to happen. If you do these things are going to result. And those predictions have been coming true. So in a grim sort of way, score one for our side.
Yeah, it's scientific confirmation is a good and useful thing, even though what it confirms may be horrific. I was when you were talking about anti-authoritarian pedagogy, I was reminded of this very unusual book called Educated by, is it Westover? Yeah, Tara Westover. Have you seen this, Steve?
No, I know her name, but I haven't seen the book.
Yeah, I'll put a link in the chat. It's a book about a young woman who has this arc from growing up with a fundamentalist, fairly paranoid family into being an academic success. Speaking of an arc, we're coming close to the end of our arc. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, there are a couple of things that I was hoping to get in.
Yeah, please.
And it's sort of in response to a couple of questions, which have been, well, how do we do this? In these 6 institutions that I've been studying, they have in common that there's no magic bullet. There's no 1, 2, 3 steps or, do this plus this, it's all going to be fine. What they've been able to do is deeply related to their history over the last 10, 20, 30 years. And it's related to the degree to which a variety of steps that they've taken align with each other and tend to support each other. So, if you have more active and collaborative learning, if you've got more project-based learning, if you've got e-portfolios, these are educational strategies that make each other stronger. Throw in writing intensive courses for just another example. But they also have been aggressive at looking at, as organizations, how do we need to change in order to stabilize and grow these educational strategies? Faculty reward systems, how in particular they recruit new students, what kind of IT operation do they have, how does the teaching center work? And then a third level of this big constellation are ways in which they interact with the wider world. And I'll just choose one example here. When several of these institutions are recruiting new students with just stuff that's online, it's very clear that they see the student as an agent of their own learning. Not that they're going to be learning by themselves, but it's just, you know, what you put into it determines what you get out of it. We're going to give you some really interesting things to work on, this, that, and the other thing. It's not at all an image of a college where the wise faculty member is presumably talking to 210 students who are taking notes. So changing the public image of the institution is important to get more of the kinds of students who will want to take advantage of what the college is offering. And if enough colleges do it, it can begin to change the public image of higher education generally. You know, take another 10 or 20 years for doing that, but if we keep working on it in these directions, these are some of the things that can come about. So to put it in a nutshell, these institutions have been making reforms of various sorts, each of which is intended to work on an institutional scale affordably and to be very long-lived, so that when they add one or two each year, they're not replacing ones that have dropped away. They're simply adding more and more elements to this increasingly powerful constellation, which as a whole is helping them improve quality, equitable access, and affordability.
These 6 examples, we need to have your book. That's just all there is to it. We need to have that out there.
Well, for you, if I haven't already, I'll lend you a copy of the manuscript. It's in production and it should be in print about the end of this year.
Well, that's a
fantastic for this program. And I agree with you. I think it could be useful.
Well, that's a fantastic point for us to end on. We've covered a staggering range of ground, really. Everything from anti-authoritarian pedagogies to the specific examples of certain universities doing reform, to the question of which metrics can be misused, to diving into the LMS and making the discussion board work. Steve, I want to thank you very much. This has been a real special hour. Thank you.
Well, it has been for me too. I'm really glad you invited me. Thank you, Brian.
Oh, pleasure. Kristen, thank you for your questions.
Thank you for having me.